Welcome back.
Hi, Catherine. So nice to be with you.
Yes, for sure. We're going to talk about boundaries today, and this is a big topic. I mean, in many areas of life, even when it doesn't even come to food, but we're going to tie it in with binge eating and recovery and just talk about the many ways that boundaries might come into play and how you can use boundaries to help support yourself.
Great. Yes, it's going to be a good discussion.
Yeah, and I mean, you and I still struggle in ways to set boundaries with people or situations or, anyone faces this on almost a daily basis.
Mhm.
So we want to say up front that we're not saying you have to have perfect boundaries in order to stop binging. We're not saying this is a cure for stopping binging, but it can come in as a tool to help, like I said, set yourself up for success.
Absolutely. And, I love quotes. And I did start the lesson I did with the group with a quote that I think is very useful as a frame, which is boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And that's my Prentice Hemphill, who talks a lot about boundaries. I mean, is an expert on boundaries. And I mean, I think that's the thing I want to say at the front is that, it's a loving act to create a boundary. It could be a personal boundary that you're setting, something for yourself in your life, which we'll get into, or a boundary with you and another person or with a situation. But it's always coming from a place of love. It's not defiance. It's not an ultimatum. It's not a punishment. Boundaries are an act of love. So I just want to say that right up front.
That's a really good way to start this conversation. And something that pops into my head as we start this conversation is the biggest boundary you're trying to set is to not binge, right? To set
Yes.
that apart from who you are. And that's the behavior you no longer want in your life. And that is a loving act. That is something you're doing for yourself. So that's the
Yeah.
number one boundary that we want to set.
Yes. I mean, if we start with food, fantastic. Exactly. I mean, if we think about brain over binge, it's like two things that you got to do, right? Eat adequately and expect and allow urges or dismiss urges, which is a boundary in and of itself. No matter what, I don't binge. That's all you've got to do. Recovery happens. You don't have to do anything else. That's the rule, right? Like that's the only rule. Everything else is a tool. But yeah, and within that, I mean, if we're going to take the food piece, so what kinds of boundaries can you create within your own formula around food, eating, binging, right? So it could be about meal times, right? Creating gentle boundaries around meal times or types of food. You might have gentle boundaries around types of food or amounts of food. I was just coaching a client today about the fact that certain foods in certain amounts can love you back, while other amounts don't love you back. And it's not necessarily about eliminating a food completely, but about creating a gentle boundary around amount,
Mhm.
right? Or even eating environments, things that will support you towards whatever goals you have with recovery. And I think here's another boundary, right? A boundary around no more restricting, right? Like restricting is out. So creating that boundary and purging and compensating and beating yourself up, like leaving out all of those actions. So creating that boundary.
Yeah, I love that. I love the term gentle boundaries. I think it's such a nice contrast with restrictive dieting because, like you said, we're giving up restriction. You're nourishing your body. That's so important to stop binging. And the idea of setting structures and limits and creating your own formula sometimes involves boundaries, but we don't want those to feel like harsh rules. We don't want that to feel like restriction because it's not. But setting those loving, gentle, self caring boundaries can be a really important way to help yourself eat adequately and help yourself avoid tipping into behaviors that are ultimately harmful to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which, of course, people can go back and listen to Redefining Restriction, right? Because if you have a health condition and then you're eating foods that exacerbate that health condition, you're harming yourself. It's not restrictive to say, if I have celiac disease, I'm not going to eat gluten because it's going to make me very sick. So it's not restrictive to go gluten free in that situation. That is a loving limit, a gentle boundary. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. I talk to clients a lot about this around meals because a lot of people have the issue of eating a meal and then continuing to go back for more and more and more. And to tell yourself, I'm going to have this meal, this is a nourishing amount of food that's going to give my body what it needs. And then to tell yourself to stop after that that is a loving boundary. And to tell yourself, I'm not going to get up and have more and more and more, even though technically maybe that's not a binge, you can set those gentle limits for yourself. And like we keep coming back to, that is an act of love and self-care. You know you've had enough. You can mentally move on. You can go back to the rest of your life without continuously going back for more and more food. And again, that's not restriction.
Yeah. And that is the opportunity for growth. It's in that moment where you have a meal and you say, that was delicious. That hit the spot. I'm so satisfied, knowing that your brain may chatter on about, I want more, 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 and you don't have more. And now suddenly you're healing your brain. You're rewiring your brain in that moment because you're having an urge and you're letting it move through you. So it's in those moments that the healing happens. I mean, that's why having meals with gentle boundaries is actually such a great path towards recovery, because it's in between the meals where you're going to be having urges, where you're going to be changing your brain.
Yeah, and I love that there's no rules around boundaries. Like if you're someone who likes six small meals, great. If you're someone who likes three big meals, two small meals or snacks, great. If you're someone who likes to eat a meal and then have a dessert after, great. Like you get to create your own boundaries and you honor your own boundaries. You're not following someone else's rules or formula.
Yeah. And again, those boundaries are coming from love. And funny thing, like that word, it always comes up, but it's like foods you love that love you back in amounts. There's the boundary that love you back, right? And leave you feeling sated. And love means you love it before, during, and after you eat it. So it's all tied to that. And yes, so much owning choice here, right? Like you're choosing. And you get to change your mind. You get to say, oh, I thought it was this amount, but actually it's not. I thought this timing worked for me. It's not working. You get to be your own best expert and researcher and figure that out as you're learning what those loving limits or gentle boundaries are.
Yeah, for sure. And this is also for people who do need that structure to make sure they're eating enough, to make sure they're staying away from behaviors that are harmful with food. Some people can have a more intuitive approach when it comes to this and be able to eat in a more flexible way, and this may not be necessary. So like we said up front, these are tools, not rules.
Absolutely. I think, we could open the conversation up to lots of other areas of life where they're not food related at all, but creating boundaries can be helpful because in taking care of those areas of your life, you're minimizing the stress on your system, nervous system regulation, all of those things that make it easier for you to access your higher brain so that when faced with food choices, you can act in that loving way.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to frame it because a lot of times our binging gets connected to events in our life and to stress. And when we look at ourselves and our patterns, we can make corrections along the way that help lead us to good choices. It doesn't mean those things all have to happen in order to not binge, but it's just a way to, again, look at our patterns, create new habits and new ways of being in the world and being with food.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, maybe we can talk about a few of those areas. Before we started the call, I was talking about creating time boundaries, right? Like that idea of noticing how you're spending your day. And if you see, oh, I'm staying up really late at night every night, either, watching shows on Netflix or being on social media or doing extra work or doing tons of chores in the house. And then the next day I'm exhausted and I don't have time to prepare food for myself. Or I notice that when I'm really tired, my appetite is like enlarged or hard to manage, right? It's like noticing those things and then saying, okay, so maybe I need to set some time boundaries for myself from love, because if I get a good night's sleep, everything else works better. My digestion works better. My brain is functioning better. I can wake up the next day and feel ready to expect and allow urges, deal with that discomfort. And also my appetite is easier to regulate.
Yeah, all that's super important. It's like looking at those two recovery goals, dismissing urges or allowing urges and eating adequately, and what is kind of holding me back from doing those things. And if you're completely exhausted, you're not in connected with your higher brain because you haven't slept, you're not eating properly, like all that can affect your ability to accomplish those two goals.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, of course, personal limits. Are you overextending yourself? Are you constantly saying yes to everything, signing up for every committee, every project? You know, and I work with a lot of people who are very high achieving people and they're amazing, but it's this do energy constantly, constantly. And then there's that fallacy we've talked before on podcasts of like, binging is my only break. It's my only downtime. It's the only way I can de-stress. When it's the opposite of the break, it's not de-stressing at all. And truly, we all deserve a break. We all need to let off steam. We all need to have moments of pause throughout the day. And if we're never saying no to anything, that's an area where, you know, we might need to set some loving limits with ourselves and do the uncomfortable thing of saying no when we mean no from love.
Yeah, and I want to kind of go on a little bit of a tangent here about that, because I think that comes with the territory of people who are prone to have issues with food. Like we tend to be people pleasers in a lot of ways. We tend to want to do, go. Like that perfectionistic mindset tends to be correlated with people with eating disorders. And I think that it's something that I was taught for sure in therapy. Like, you know, if you can learn to not be such a people pleaser, if you can learn to, you know, set these boundaries, you won't want to binge, or it will free you up to, you know, not need to binge to cope. And, you know, that's not what we're saying here. But I want to say that it can be hard to set a boundary as a person who's a people pleaser, as a person who struggles with that. And so I would set a boundary, love to not do things and not go. But then I'd feel so guilty about that. I would feel so like I let people down. And then, you know, I would think that that made me binge. So, like, I want to tell you here that your lower brain is going to kind of make excuses to binge no matter what, right? If you say no, you might feel guilty. Your lower brain is say, oh, like you're such a failure. You might as well binge. If you say yes and do, oh, I need a break. I need to binge. So, like, really be aware as you set these boundaries that your lower brain can use kind of anything to justify a binge. So, remember to kind of separate your ability to set boundaries with your ability to binge and not binge, because setting boundaries is something that's a hard thing that we all kind of have to face every day. And it's something that you'll practice at, you'll get better. And even if you don't strike the right balance, you can still keep that primary boundary with yourself of I don't binge.
Yeah, I mean, 1,000,000%. There's so much there. I mean, again, it's like, yes, it is uncomfortable to set a boundary. It's even more uncomfortable to enforce the boundary once you've set it, right? And I'm going to go back to the ultimate boundary that we want you all to be setting is to not binge. And if you can have an urge and let it move through you can also learn to communicate boundaries with people or situations in your lives. That is an opportunity for growth. I mean, setting a boundary and following through on it is the ultimate in productive discomfort. And so you go in with eyes wide open. Just like I say, when you're ready to recover, you go in eyes wide open. It's not going to be super easy. You're going to have discomfort, but you want the productive discomfort of growth and change, not the destructive discomfort of binging or saying yes constantly and driving yourself into the ground. So again, boundaries come from love and they're for you, but they're not against the person or the situation that you're setting the boundary. And they can make your relationships better because you're actually showing up honestly, right? And so when you communicate them, you want to expect that discomfort to be there,
Yeah.
right? And do things. So you go in eyes wide open. I'm going to set a boundary and then I'm going to have urges. Probably, right? Oh my God, I can't believe I said that. Why did I say that? They're going to be so mad at me. I shouldn't have done that, whatever it is. And then that discomfort's going to come. And then the next thing that's going to happen is, my friend Murray the dinosaur is going to be like, a binge would be good. You're in danger, right? And so it's like expecting all of that and be like, oh, I'm just growing here. I'm just setting a boundary. Let me take a breath, right? That's all that's going on here. And again, when you do it from this place of love and with clarity, like I'm making this decision because I can't show up as my best self when I do this thing, or when I set this boundary, it's because I'm at capacity and I'm speaking my truth. I'm speaking it honestly, and I know it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but we'll all figure it out. We'll all survive.
Yeah, I think having that self-compassion in these situations is really important because boundaries are difficult. I mean, people write whole books about boundaries. People have, blogs and podcasts about boundaries. This is not easy. So when you do it and you have that discomfort, like you were talking about, know that that doesn't mean you did something wrong. Like I said, you can keep practicing and getting better, but the reality is you can't control other people's reactions. The reality is some people are nearly impossible to set good boundaries with, and that is another topic altogether, but it's a hard thing. So I think, yeah, like you said, if you can experience an urge, you can experience the discomfort of boundaries.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the beautiful thing about recovery is that these are transferable skills. So
Mhm.
when you see, oh, this thing urges that I thought was like the hardest thing in my life to deal with, when I see I can have an urge and it moves through me and I survive and I didn't turn to food, then it's like getting back to our curiosity podcast. It's like, what else could I do? And maybe there's like some area in your life where you're thinking, maybe if I can be uncomfortable, have an urge and not eat, I could also speak my truth in this situation, deal with that discomfort, and see that like I'll still stand. It's like dip your toe in with easy things, set a time
Mhm.
boundary, right? Do things that are just, start with yourself, start with setting some boundaries for yourself in areas where you see like I'm not helping myself here. Try that out, deal with that discomfort because it's going to generate discomfort. It's going to be 10 o'clock at night and your brain's going to be like, oh, but I love that show. I just really want to see the next episode of Emily in Paris. Not me. Right. And I'll just be tired tomorrow, right? Like see that discomfort come up and say, no, you can watch it tomorrow, right? And deal with that. Say, go me, I did it. Celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. Put a bead in a jar, whatever you need to do, and see, oh wow, I just set a boundary. Like it might be in shopping areas, like where you're going to say, I'm not spending any money right now on things that I don't need. And so allow those urges to come up. Look for little areas before you tackle the big ones, in relationships, for example, which can
Yeah.
probably be the hardest area.
Yeah, that's a great idea to practice the ones with yourself first and starting with things that are doable and then working up to things that are more difficult. Because I think when we get to those really more difficult things in relationships, sometimes there are areas maybe you feel like you can't set a boundary at this point. Like think of people caring for small children, caring for aging parents, you're in that caregiver role. Sometimes boundaries can be a luxury, honestly.
Right.
So, and that's okay. And that's where we get back to you can still avoid a binge, but there are probably small ways you can have boundaries and add self-care, even if there's areas where boundaries just don't feel like an option at this point, and that's okay too.
And, I think again, it just gets back to clarity. So before you create a boundary, before you communicate a boundary, it's about being really certain with yourself. This is something I want to do for myself. And again, it could be a boundary you're setting with yourself, fine. But if you're communicating in a boundary with another person, if anybody's listening and that's something that they want to dabble in, it's about getting that clarity that before you set it, you're 100% committed to following through on it, even when you don't feel like it, even when you don't want to.
Yeah.
And that's where, some future self journaling would be good. Some future self visualization would be good, where you actually like visualize the conversation, how you're going to do it, what you're going to say, the discomfort that you're going to feel, how you're going to take care of yourself in that discomfort. Do you need support through that? It's not about just like blurting it out. Again, a boundary is not an ultimatum. It doesn't come from anger. It's not something you do impetuously. It's something that you do with careful thought and love.
I was thinking maybe we could get into specific ways that boundary setting can help someone in recovery. Like we talked about earlier about maybe having meal times or different ways that you're trying to eat to help yourself. And sometimes that can interfere with our schedule or what others in our household are doing, and it can become a little dicey. So, how could boundary setting come into play here for people trying to recover?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of ways. I mean, first of all, in the beginning of recovery, there's this need sometimes to protect yourself, right? Protecting your space, protecting your privacy. Sometimes that can happen, right? Protecting your meal times because those meal times are so important to helping you recover that consistency, showing your brain that you're actually healing and that you're nourishing it on almost on the clock, but that you're feeding yourself regularly and consistently. So if you're living with people or you're in a relationship with someone who eats differently, right? Who maybe has very chaotic eating and that works for them, or they eat all day long and that works for them. But for you, you're seeing that's not working for me. So that could be a moment of communicating this boundary that, like, you can eat however you want. I need to eat in this way. I'm going to be doing this from now on. And I really need your support in that. And you can eat whenever you want, but I am going to stop at these times to have meals. That is very important for me. And even if we're out and we're running around doing things, it's going to be necessary for me to either bring food with me or stop and go to a restaurant to get a meal. And I'm going to speak my truth about that at regular times throughout the day.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very, very important, because there can be relationships where people say, well, come on, we'll wait, we can go a few more hours. That can happen. And that's a very important moment where it's like, you can wait, but I'm going to eat now.
Yeah.
And that's said with love, but also a sense of like calm confidence that, like, I know for myself, this is my truth. I've made this decision, and it's maybe uncomfortable at first to set that boundary, as we were talking about before, but it's about knowing I'm doing this because I'm healing from an eating disorder.
Yeah, I really like all of that because we can't control what other people do. And you, of course, don't want to rest your choices and your ability to eat adequately or avoid binges on what others do or don't do. Like, that's really important. But you can say, this is what I'm going to do for myself. An example I think of is a client I worked with had a husband who liked to snack a lot on the couch at night, and they used to do it together. But she realized that was tipping into binging behavior like almost every night. So it was something that she had to stop doing, and she had her own snack and then went to bed and just drew that boundary for herself, but didn't say you can't do this anymore, and also didn't say I'll never do this again. It's just, for now I need to change my habits and my routine in order to develop some confidence, and maybe one day I can go back to it. So hopefully that gives you some practical examples of how this could come into play.
Yeah, I mean, and I think in another area also, around the body, right? Like, this is your body and you get to set boundaries around what gets discussed and what doesn't get discussed. So if people are making comments to you, that's an area where you can step in and say, I don't want to talk about my body.
Mhm.
And again, that's that calm confidence of, like, I've made this decision and it's not up for conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and that can be really helpful in public when people bring up weight. I mean, it's definitely a common topic. Well, family gatherings, social gatherings, people will start talking about diets, weight, and you really can't control what other people are talking about. I mean, you can make requests, but there's knowing what you will do. Maybe you get up from the table, maybe you go to the restroom, you change the topic, you bring up something else that's more important and interesting than weight. So yeah, it's really about knowing what you'll do in the situations and not trying to control other people.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. And I love that example. Those are many of the strategies I offer to clients. And that's one example. And it pings something in my brain, which is that often we don't need to state the boundary. We just need to create it in our mind and then follow through on it for ourselves. So if we've decided that I'm done talking about dieting and weight and that whole conversation, I'm finished with it, then yes, it's this personal choice that you've made. And then you communicate the boundary by not engaging in the conversation. But it's not this overt thing like, I'm never going to talk about that again.
Mhm.
It's just gently changing the conversation, getting up and washing the dishes, going to the bathroom, taking a walk outside, just leaving the scene. Right? There are gentle ways to do that. I love that.
Yeah, for sure. And all the while knowing that if you find yourself in that conversation, you never have to binge, right? If you end up talking about it, like if you end up breaking one of your own boundaries around one of these things we're talking about, you still can dismiss the urges to break your primary boundary of not binging.
A
Um,
1,000,000%. That's so good. And getting back to our perfectionistic tendencies, it's like you're going to break your boundaries. Like it's going to happen. Like be prepared for that. It's going to happen. Just treat it like a learning moment. What went well? What didn't go well? What will I do differently? Recommit, reconnect, and just keep moving forward because it's going to happen. You're going to forget that you set a boundary. It's going
Yeah.
to happen. So go into that with eyes wide open too.
Yeah, for sure. I have a final thought about this, and then we'll ask you for any final thoughts as well. But I mentioned earlier about the lower brain using boundaries or different things in your life to justify binging, and kind of no matter what you do, it can try to justify a binge because that's how habits work. What happened with me and what I know happens with other people is your lower brain will offer binging as kind of a way to set a boundary. And I'll try to kind of explain it. If you're so exhausted running around doing a million things, your lower brain will say, oh, just binge and then you can rest. Or like, I don't want to go to a social gathering. I'm really just dreading it. And your brain will say, oh, just binge and then you won't have to go. But you don't have to go. You don't need to binge to rest. You don't need to binge to avoid the social gathering. So it's almost like your lower brain will say, oh, binging, if you binge, then you can set the boundary. We want you to realize you can set the boundary even if you don't binge. Does that
Yeah,
make
I love
sense?
it. Yes, absolutely. I mean, any sentence that includes just binge and then, you can always just pull the just binge part and do the and then, right? I mean, always, 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 binging always and only makes everything worse. And there's never a reason to binge. And the brain is going to offer it up as a solution to almost any situation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
that's
sure.
such a great example. It's so funny. It's really
I
true.
know. Yeah, I would allow myself to sleep in if I binged, but I could have just slept in, It was the lower
Right.
brain would tell me that to get my higher brain on board, so I would do it, but it was never the truth, right?
Right, exactly. It's never a way to take a break. We all
Hmm.
we all deserve to rest. We all deserve to not go to a party if we really don't want to go to the party. We all deserve to take those pauses, and we never need to binge in order to have a valid reason to do it. Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts about boundaries?
I mean, just that I think it's really great if you're listening to this podcast, obviously recovery is something that's on your mind. And so, in the beginning, it could be good to just figure out like what are some boundaries that would be most helpful to my recovery today, right now. Start really small. So, we already offered the biggest one, which is eat adequately, expect and allow urges, which could include some gentle meal times. But are there some routines and structures that will support me in eating adequately and dismissing urges? Are there some gentle, loving boundaries that I could put into place that will help me prioritize recovery? And just do those things.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be in every area of life. And as I said before, these are all transferable skills. So when you see, oh my goodness, I am doing it here. Amazing. Now you can be with that discomfort. Where else can you apply it? So just get curious and move things over, but don't think you have to take on everything all at once.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because it can be overwhelming. Like I said, people write whole books about boundaries. This is big. This is like, pretty deep stuff in our lives. So when you think about recovery, just think what boundaries will help me better dismiss urges, what boundaries will help me better eat adequately and work on those and start with the ones that feel the most doable and then continue from there.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. And of course, if you need support with this, we are here to help you. The group is always available. That is a wonderful place to practice with boundaries or get some one-on-one coaching, whatever you need. But like coaching can be really helpful in working through that discomfort with support.
Yeah, and I think just even determining the situations where boundaries may be needed, where you may need to set yourself up for success by protecting your sleep, protecting your meal times, different things like that to talk through and like really what's necessary for you personally in order to accomplish those two recovery goals.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. This has been a great conversation about boundaries.
Thank you, Catherine. So good to be with you.